Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
Coming up on To the Contrary, the Supreme Court and race-based affirmative action. What happens now? Then, the Catholic Church considers updating its position on welcoming LGBTQ plus parishioners and giving women more power. I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the justices and affirmative action. The U.S. Supreme Court is set to decide whether to restrict use of affirmative action in college admissions in a landmark case. Two specific race-based admissions programs were challenged by an anti-affirmative action group, one at Harvard, one at the University of North Carolina. The group alleged using race as a factor in admissions was discriminatory. This is not the first time the court has taken up the issue of affirmative action. In 1978, the justices struck down the use of racial quotas, but upheld using race as one factor among many in admissions. It's also thought that this will not be the last time the Supreme Court weighs in on this issue. Joining us today are Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, Democrat from Washington, D.C., Linda Chavez, who chairs the Center for Equal Opportunity, Sam Bennett of the New York Amsterdam News, and Tiana Lowe Doescher, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. So, Eleanor, it seems to me that obviously this is going to be a huge landmark ruling when it comes down. It seems to me that the colleges could have taken care of this and seen it coming by changing things to basing admissions or giving extra points to students from low-income families, which, as we all know, economic success in this country tracks with racial background, because, generally speaking, because the people who make less income have been victims of discrimination forever. Why didn't they, get ahead of the Supreme Court and instead of being told what to do, adopt a category, one of many? I mean, they base admissions on all kinds of things like test scores, writing ability, extracurricular activities, legacy, whether your parents went to the college or not. So why didn't they just change race to economics? Because that would have given an advantage without using race as a category to low-income people, most of whom are who are represented much greater in lower income categories in this country than white people are.
Those categories may or may not be interchangeable, but the court was struck at the time of Bakke by the lack of diversity. Now, you are indicating that there are many different ways to get diversity. Problem is, we haven't tried all of those ways. We know for sure that race will get us the diversity we need. Now, affirmative action, as we know it, was supposed to be limited in time. That is to say, one of the justices said, well, we think we'll straighten all this out within a quarter of a century or so. But that is doubtful at this time.
Well, the other thing, too, when I was going to college, I don't know if things have changed, but two other categories that used to count were also geographic diversity, because colleges, especially national colleges like Harvard and the best colleges and the colleges who could get the best students, didn't only want them from their own areas. They wanted them from all over the country. That doesn't seem to matter anymore. Why not use one of those, Tiana, as a category?
I think that you are actually pointing out something that gives the lie to what they want in diversity, right? If this were about trying to represent the country, make your college look more like America, you would be focusing on that. If you were trying to benefit the students that have had the least opportunity, you would be focusing on economic opportunity. But instead, if you look at the breakdown of the minorities who have been favored in especially these elite university admissions processes, it is, statistically speaking, not a representative sample of, let's say, Hispanic applicants. It is wealthier Hispanic applicants. It is wealthier Black applicants. It is wealthier white applicants, right? We know that the primary discriminated against race here are Asian Americans, who also are not all uniformly rich. So a lot of this does have to do with they need students who not only can afford to go to these schools, but parents that will donate, families that will become legacy families, which is why in these legacy admissions, it's something like, I think 25% of all white applicants to Harvard are indeed legacies.
I actually, several years back, interviewed the leader of the group that brought the lawsuit, at least the leader at the time. And I looked up the data to make sure I have the most current data. Asian Americans make up 5.9% of the US population. They are just under 30% of Harvard.
Right.
What I don't understand when, and maybe somebody can jump in and tell me besides you, because you're on the other side of the issue, Tiana, but what do they want? Do they want 50, 100% of the student body of Harvard?
Bonnie, can I jump in here? Because my organization, the Center for Equal Opportunity, has been involved in this struggle since we were founded in 1995. We have done studies at 80 colleges and universities to look at the admission standards, and we looked very carefully at Harvard and what Harvard was doing. The fact is, if you want to be an elite school, and if you claim to be admitting the students who score the best and do the best and have the best chance of succeeding at your university, you're probably going to be overrepresented with Asian Americans. That shouldn't bother us at all. And if there's any group in the United States besides Blacks and Native Americans, I would say that Asian Americans are probably the group that has been most discriminated against officially. They were barred from entering the United States. They weren't allowed to become citizens until 1965. And so I would suggest that what we need to do is exactly what you hinted at, which is to look at other factors that give us a more diverse student population. You can look at geography. Some schools do that. You should look at socioeconomic status. Some proponents of affirmative action have even suggested that in light of the Supreme Court decision, that you could use zip codes to try to identify low-income, heavily minority districts and try to gear your admissions on the basis of zip codes. But doing it by race has been not effective. And what we found from our studies and what other people have found is that admitting students who have lower test scores means they're less likely to graduate, they're less likely to major in fields that will be remunerative to them when they graduate. And Richard Sander of UCLA, who's done a lot of work on this, suggests that in the law school, where these preferences are also used, you would actually have more Black lawyers today without preferential admission than you have with it, because students get put into situations where they're much less likely to succeed. And he has documented this with thousands looking at thousands of cases where students with lower LSAT scores ended up going to law schools where they were much less likely to pass the bar. But if they had actually gone to the schools where they were on the same level as all of the other students, the pass rate for the bar in those schools, even with lower scores, was higher than those same students going to more elite schools.
I think we're missing the point here. Let's put the reality on the table. I mean, I represent New York Amsterdam News, which has been writing about racial justice journalism since 1905. And the truth of the matter is, Blacks in our country came to this country in 1619 enslaved. And so a progressive court, a court with vision, which is what we've had for so long in this country, being replaced by a conservative court with the lack of that vision. If we have systemic racism, the only way to solve it is through systemic solutions like affirmative action. We cannot dispute the fact. I know Asian Americans have been, discriminated against, per Linda's point, Native Americans, but no one has been enslaved except the Black community. And the Black community has been disproportionately, I don't want to say favored, but has been found affirmative action to be a very positive impact for them. Students that might not have ever been able to go to college were enabled to do so. So I have to say, we're missing the forest for the trees here. We need an activist court with systemic solutions to correct systemic problems in our country, which is, in this case, racism, particularly for Black Americans.
The article I was reading about the census and the percentage of Asian Americans in this country has not gone up. I mean, it is the fastest growing group of immigrants now, but it has not gone up anywhere nearly as quickly as the number of Asians getting into Harvard anyway. How can you say that's not successful?
Bonnie, if you want to talk about exactly what Sam is talking about, 40% of the Black students admitted into Harvard are coming from Africa. They are not people who were enslaved in the United States or whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. It is simply preference based on skin color. African immigrants are extremely successful in the United States. African immigrants have the highest education levels of groups coming to the United States. And if 40% or thereabouts of the students admitted under these racially preferential programs at places like Harvard are indeed either themselves foreign-born or the first generation of foreign-born, that takes away the whole argument that this is trying to make up for past discrimination. I frankly thought it was wrong when they moved to diversity as opposed to making up for past discrimination.
And again, I apologize. I have to vehemently disagree. Skin color, whether you're an immigrant here, whether you were native born, and as you said, Linda, the descendant of slaves, racism is real in this country, and it's rampant and it is systemic. So I have to disagree with your point and your prior point that why would we abandon affirmative action in colleges to say, well, we should start earlier? Well, we're not starting earlier. We have huge problems and disparity in education, huge.
Some governors are trying to start earlier. That is why school choice and expanded voucher programs starting at the K through 12 level is a great way of enhancing diversity and equality of opportunity, making it so that way your zip code isn't your destiny. So that way it's not only the wealthy who get to go to charter schools and private schools when it comes to these voucher school states. And you talk about a court with vision. I don't want a court with a conservative vision or with a liberal vision. I want a Supreme Court that reads the law for what it is and makes sure that these universities that we give, millions, tens of millions of dollars in federal funding to, billions if you're counting Pell Grants and student loans that are footed by the U.S. taxpayer. I want them to follow the law. I do not want them discriminating against Asian Americans, giving us lower personality scores so that way they can rig the game for wealthier other minorities.
Therein lies the problem. You say the law? There is no the law. And I learned that by going to law school. There's precedent on both sides of each issue, depending on how far back you want to go. And judges essentially, whether we want to admit it or not, vote the way their politics were before they became judges.
That's right.
From affirmative action to Catholic Church changes. The Vatican Synod of Bishops and Advisory Council to the Pope will soon be considering some major cultural advancements for Catholics. The Synod will examine whether women should become deacons. It will also consider whether the Church should adopt a more welcoming attitude toward LGBTQ plus Catholics. A University of Newcastle survey of more than 17,000 Catholic women found nearly 80% believe women should hold leadership roles in the Church. 68% support women's eligibility for priesthood. The survey showed widespread support for women priests in all countries except Poland and South Africa. 80% of Catholics also support LGBT inclusion. Linda, as one of my two best friends, a Catholic, advises me, remember, this is the group that took 500 years to admit that the earth was indeed not flat. So we don't expect any quick advancements, or if we do, we're probably going to be disappointed. But what do you think the Synod will recommend?
I think you'll see a larger role for women in lay positions. I think you may see a larger role for religious women who are in religious orders. I don't expect you're going to see women priests anytime soon. And with respect to the issue of including gay people in the church, gay people are perfectly welcome in the church now. Now, it is still considered sinful to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage between a man and a woman. So I'm not, thinking that the church is going to change its position on that anytime soon. But that doesn't mean I actually had someone who once worked for me and was a friend of mine. He's since died, who was gay, actively gay, but also very Catholic. I didn't talk to him about what he said in confession, but the Catholic Church has always been forgiving of people for their sins and welcoming them into the church. But I don't think they're going to change their position on whether sex outside of marriage is permissible.
Well, Bonnie, these listening sessions, it turned out to be revolutionary with people saying that women should have leadership positions, perhaps even as priests, but certainly leadership positions and positions of equality. They want more women ordained. Now, for the Catholic Church, this is a change of the millennium. This is a revolutionary change. These listening sessions, if Rome listens to them and does anything even slightly like what they are wanting, you would see a change in the Catholic Church, the likes of which we have never seen anywhere else in the world.
Obviously, this is all driven by Pope Francis, who has a much more welcoming, open attitude towards change in the church than probably most of his bishops, because he is so advanced culturally beyond where the church has ever been. And but do you think his movement for change is based on idealism, like this is where we really ought to be? Or just take a look at Europe and see all the churches that are empty and are selling, and that's starting to happen in great numbers here because of the church pedophilia, the priest pedophilia scandal. In Europe, it's because the more educated people get, the more they tend to leave the church. And even the majority of relatively new Catholics in this country are immigrants, not native born.
His motivation may be in part from these listening sessions, but also in part from what's happening to the Catholic Church itself, with more and more people leaving the church. And if you want to make sure you keep the faithful, you better keep up with what they indeed are beginning to think and to say. And I must say, the kinds of responses that are coming are unlike anything we ever would have thought or from Catholics. So if these listening sessions are real, you could see changes of a kind that we could never have contemplated.
Eleanor used a word that I just want to focus on. She said revolutionize. I believe it's actually restoring. Look, as an Eastern Orthodox, we have had a long history of having deaconesses in the church, and that's because female deacons are organic to the early church. Not only that, they are in the Bible. They are in the New Testament, right? The Apostle Paul refers to Phoebe, to Saint Phoebe, who is seen as a saint in all the major Christian religions, as the Koine Greek word for deacon. This is something that is a restoration of the original practice. The fact that the Catholic Church has not had female deaconesses, that has been an aberration away from the original religion, right? That is the Orthodox interpretation of the text. With regards to the LGBT issue, I think that because it has been coded as political, there has been a way that Christians have focused on, again, if you are a close textualist in terms of your reading of the New Testament, if you believe in traditional marriage, if you believe that homosexual action is a sin, it is, first of all, no more of a sin than adultery, right, which shows up as one of the 10 commandments. But secondarily, the act is a sin. You cannot believe that the person is inherently less than anyone else who sins. And we all do. The only sinless man in history is Jesus Christ himself, right? So having a more open attitude towards we will accept people for who they are, that doesn't involve rewriting scripture, right? You can still interpret it as you will. So I think that his level of inclusion is something that will restore the church without degrading it. It is restoring it to what Jesus initially wanted for the church.
That may be the truth or not, but that doesn't mean that what seems like, anyway, a majority of Catholics around the world are fighting like crazy.
Bonnie, can't we want to take it back? Can't we want to have the most faithful interpretation of the original Greek New Testament, the most original studies of what the church fathers and mothers wanted?
Okay, but obviously doctrine and church teachings change over time. If you go to the catacombs in Rome, you can see Catholic ceremonies with all women and being led by women. Clearly,
absolutely,
women were leaders in the early church. But if you go back to the Council of Nicaea in 331, I believe it was AD, you will see that half of what used to constitute the Old Testament anyway was thrown out, and much of it, quite frankly, by today's standards, pornographic material. And there was a rewriting and changing of the New Testament as well. So these political reformations happen all the time in the church.
Absolutely. But I mean, also remember, the Catholic Church's Counter-Reformation was indeed 500 years ago. Right. And no one viewed the Counter-Reformation as a departure from religion. The correct way to think about it is trying to hearken back to the original apotheosis of what the church is supposed to be. That's a good thing. Maybe the Catholic Church has been overdue for it. Viewing failing membership and realizing you are not serving God as you should be because you're alienating your followers is a reason to try and reevaluate. How are you messaging? How are you staying true to the written text and abiding by the spirit of the law, while also trying to expand your membership? And this does not strike me as something that's just trying to make it, political or make it easy or relaxing standards. It's looking back to what has the church historically done and how can we restore that?
Bonnie, could I just say a word about the membership of the church? It isn't actually shrinking. The Catholic Church is the largest denomination in the world. But it is also true that the growth in the Catholic Church is coming in Africa, and that the African bishops are absolutely the most conservative of any of the groups. And where the Catholic Church is losing membership in Latin America, it's losing it to Pentecostal and other fundamentalist Protestant religions.
Well, and I was just in Uganda last month, and Africans there at least in that country, they still love America, feel very beholden to it, but also to a person had the attitude of, how dare you try to tell us how to worship? We're going to, meaning, don't tell us we can't believe against, if you will, homosexuality, and cast out and even prosecute people who engage in homosexuality.
First of all, I say I couldn't agree more with Tiana. I think in terms of this is a restoration. I'm a church-going, choir-singing follower of Jesus Christ, and he embraced women, he embraced lepers, and women were ascended into leadership positions. It's all over the New Testament. And actually, it was the Reformation movement that actually took all the female out of the Catholic Church. At least the Catholic Church, you had Virgin Mary, right? So the Protestants are way more patriarchal than the Catholics are. But what I think is really, really important is here we have a conservative Supreme Court in America that has, in my opinion, lost its vision about what it can do through jurisprudence to affect systemic change in our country, needed change. And you have a leader, current leader of the Catholic Church, that is using his position to do the radical act of listening to his congregants and finding out what they want. And law is organic. It reflects the mores of its time. The church is organic. It reflects the mores of its time. So I think it's really wonderful to see the Catholic Church and its leader listening and potentially considering change.
All right, terrific. Thank you, everybody, for a fascinating program. That's it for this edition. Keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.